For 5,000 years we've accepted a story. The gods descended. They shaped us from clay and breath. They built ziggurats that scraped the heavens. And then, silence. They vanished. Generations of scholars assumed they simply left. Mission complete. Interest faded. Humanity abandoned like a forgotten experiment. But buried within the oldest texts on Earth, written in wedge-shaped script on tablets of river clay, lies a different truth. The Sumerians didn't describe gods who grew distant. They described gods who grew afraid. Something changed in the centuries before their departure. Something shifted the balance. Tonight, we read what the priests actually wrote and discover that we were never the ones who were abandoned. We were the ones who rose. For 5,000 years, we have accepted a story so familiar that we no longer question its shape or wonder whether its ending might be wrong. The gods descended. They shaped us from clay and breath. They built ziggurats that scraped the heavens and temples that glowed with gold and lapis lazuli. And then silence. They vanished. Generations of scholars have assumed they simply left, their mission complete, their interest faded, humanity abandoned like a forgotten experiment in some cosmic laboratory. But buried within the oldest texts on Earth, written in wedge-shaped script on tablets of river clay, lies a different truth. The Sumerians did not describe gods who grew distant. They described gods who grew afraid. Something changed in the centuries before their departure. Something shifted the balance of power between heaven and earth. Tonight, we read what the priests actually wrote. We examine what the translators have rendered, and we discover that we were never the ones who were abandoned. We were the ones who rose. In a climate-controlled archive in Philadelphia, in the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, there is a drawer. It is an unremarkable drawer in an unremarkable cabinet, one of hundreds that line the storage rooms where ancient artifacts wait in temperature-regulated darkness. Inside this drawer, wrapped in acid-free tissue and catalogued with a number that means nothing to anyone who has not spent years in such places, sits a tablet. It measures roughly 4 inches by 3 inches. It weighs almost nothing. A child could hold it in one hand. The clay from which it was formed came from the banks of the Euphrates River, sometime around 1900 BCE, give or take a century. A scribe whose name we will never know pressed a reed stylus into its wet surface, leaving the wedge-shaped impressions we call cuneiform, and then the tablet was baked or dried in the sun and placed in an archive where it remained until archaeologists extracted it from the Iraqi soil in the early 20th century. It is one of hundreds of thousands of such tablets. Some record grain shipments, some record legal disputes, some record the prayers of the desperate and the boasts of kings, and some, like this one, record stories about the gods. The physical reality of these objects is important to understand before we go any further. These are not legends passed down through countless retellings, degraded by time and transformed by each generation of storytellers. These are primary sources. They are documents written by people who believed they were recording truth, composed in languages we can now read with considerable accuracy, preserved by the very medium that makes them so humble. Clay does not rot. Clay does not burn easily. Clay waits. And what the clay has been waiting to tell us may be very different from what we have been willing to hear. The mainstream scholarly interpretation of Sumerian religion treats the gods as mythological projections, natural forces personified, psychological archetypes given names and stories. The sky became An, the storm became Enlil, the waters became Enki. Human beings, struggling to understand a world that must have seemed capricious and terrifying, populated that world with beings whose motives could be understood, appeased, and perhaps manipulated through prayer and sacrifice. This interpretation has the virtue of simplicity and the comfort of keeping the universe safely materialist. The gods were never real, they were metaphors, and their disappearance from human experience requires no explanation because there was nothing to disappear. Then there is the alternative view, popularized in the 20th century and now familiar to millions through books and documentaries and late-night speculation. This view takes the ancient texts at something closer to face value. The Anunnaki were not metaphors. They were beings, perhaps extraterrestrial in origin, who came to Earth in the distant past for purposes of their own. And they possessed advanced technology that appeared as magic to primitive humans. They genetically engineered or otherwise created humanity to serve their needs. And eventually, for reasons that vary depending on who is telling the story, they departed, leaving behind confused myths and mysterious monuments, and a species that has spent millennia trying to remember what it has forgotten. This interpretation has the virtue of taking ancient testimony seriously and the excitement of reframing human history as a story with players beyond our planet. But here is what both interpretations share, and this shared assumption is what we must now question. Both the mainstream scholars and the alternative theorists assume that the gods left on their own terms. Whether the Anunnaki were mythological projections that faded as human consciousness evolved, or whether they were literal beings who completed their mission and departed for destinations unknown, the assumption is the same. They chose to go. Their departure was voluntary. We, humanity, were passive recipients of their decision. We were created, perhaps. We were taught, certainly. And then we were left, like children whose parents have moved away without leaving a forwarding address. This framework has shaped not only how we understand ancient texts, but how we understand ourselves. We are the abandoned species. We are the orphans of the cosmos. We look up at the stars and wonder why we were left behind, what we did wrong, whether they will ever return. But what if we are reading the story backward? What if the gods did not leave because they were finished with us? What if they left because of us? To understand what really happened, we must go back before the beginning, to the time before humanity existed, to the cosmogony that the Sumerians inherited and recorded and believed. In the beginning, there was water. Not water as we understand it, a chemical compound of hydrogen and oxygen, but water as the primordial substance, the undifferentiated potential from which all things would emerge. The Sumerians called this original state Namu, the goddess who was the sea that gave birth to heaven and earth. From Namu came An, the sky, and Kai, the earth, joined together in an embrace so close that nothing could exist between them. And from the union of An and Ki came the gods we call the Anunnaki, whose name tells us everything we need to know about their nature and their origin. The word Anunnaki is typically translated as those of royal blood or offspring of the prince, but a more literal rendering of its components suggests a different meaning. An is heaven. Na is a genitive particle meaning of or from. Ki is earth. Unna or Unaki suggests descent or those who came down. The Anunnaki are those who from heaven to earth came down. This is not poetry. This is not metaphor. This is how they named themselves and how the Sumerians understood them. They descended. They arrived. They came from somewhere else to somewhere here. The separation of heaven and earth that allowed the Anunnaki to descend was accomplished, according to the Sumerian texts, by Enlil, the Lord of the Command, the god of the air that now existed between the sky above and the ground below. Enlil carved out the space in which existence could occur. He separated his parents, An and Kai, and in doing so created the cosmos as a place where things could happen and beings could move and civilizations could rise. And once that space existed, the Anunnaki descended into it, bringing with them the structures and systems and technologies that would shape the earth for ages to come. The Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest creation narratives we possess, describes what happened next. The gods did not arrive as visitors or explorers, wandering an empty planet with curiosity. They arrived as colonizers, as builders, as rulers who intended to establish permanent dominion over the world they had claimed. The text describes the founding of the first cities, not by humans, but by gods. Each city established as a center of divine power with its own patron deity and its own purpose in the grand design. The Eridu, the oldest, was sacred to Enki, the god of wisdom and sweet waters. It was here that the gods first established their presence, and archaeological evidence confirms that Eridu was indeed one of the earliest settlements in Mesopotamia, with remains dating back to around 5,400 BCE. Nippur belonged to Enlil himself, the administrative capital of the divine realm, where the fates of gods and mortals alike were decreed. Uruk would become the domain of Inanna, the goddess of love and war, and would grow into one of the largest cities of the ancient world. Ur, later famous as the birthplace of Abraham, was sacred to Nanna, the moon god. Each city a node in a network, each temple a point of contact between heaven and earth, each ziggurat a stairway for beings who moved between realms. The Anunnaki who established this order were not a chaotic assembly of equal powers. They were organized, hierarchical, specialized, and reigned supreme from the distant heavens, rarely interfering directly but holding ultimate authority. Enlil served as the active executive, the one who gave commands and expected obedience, whose word could not be overturned even by An himself. Enki was the engineer and problem solver, the keeper of the Me, those divine powers or technologies or decrees that governed how civilization functioned. Ninmah, also called Ninhursag, was the mother goddess, concerned with fertility and birth and the biological processes that sustained life. Below these great gods were ranks of lesser deities, each with portfolios and responsibilities, each bound by the cosmic hierarchy that held everything in place. And below, even them, were the Igigi, the gods of heaven who served the Anunnaki, who performed the labor that the great gods required but did not wish to perform themselves. This is the crucial detail that mainstream interpretations often overlook, and alternative theorists sometimes fail to emphasize sufficiently. The Anunnaki did not do their own work. They established a system in which lesser beings labored on their behalf, maintaining the channels that watered the fields, digging the mines that produced metals, performing the endless tasks that civilization requires. The Igigi were divine beings, immortal and powerful by any human standard, but within the cosmic hierarchy, they were workers. They were the ones who sweated, And this arrangement, we learned from the tablets, was not stable. The concept of the me deserves particular attention because it illuminates how the Anunnaki maintained their power and how that power would eventually be challenged. The me were not merely laws or customs. They were something more fundamental, more tangible, more like what we might call technologies or source codes, or the operating principles of reality itself. There were me for kingship, and me for truth, and me for the descent into the underworld, and me for the scribal arts, and me for music, and me for the working of copper, and me for everything that made civilization possible. The gods possessed these me. They controlled access to them. They granted limited use of certain me to favored cities and favored servants, always maintaining the essential hierarchy in which divine power remained supreme and mortal capability remained bounded. To possess the me was to possess power. To lack them was to be dependent on those who held them. And the great gods guarded the me jealously, understanding perhaps instinctively that knowledge shared is power distributed, and power distributed is hierarchy threatened. For generations beyond counting, this order held. The Anunnaki walked the earth they had claimed, residing in their temples, receiving their offerings, directing the activities of the world according to their will. The Igigi toiled in their service, maintaining the systems that kept civilization functioning. And below everything, beneath divine notice for the most part, the earth waited. The clay waited. The raw material of something new waited for the moment when the divine order would require a solution to a problem it had not anticipated, because labor is weight, even for immortal shoulders, because even the gods grow tired, because the arrangement that seemed eternal was already straining at its seams, and something would need to change, something would need to be made. The breaking point came not from humanity, which did not yet exist, but from the gods themselves, from those lesser immortals called the Igigi, who had been assigned the work that the great Anunnaki would not perform. The tablets tell us that the Igigi had labored for 40 years, though the number may be symbolic, digging the beds of the great rivers, maintaining the canals that made agriculture possible, working the mines in the depths of the earth where precious metals waited to be extracted. 40 years of divine labor in conditions that the texts describe with surprising frankness as difficult, as exhausting, as unbearable. And at the end of those 40 years, the Igigi did something that would change the course of cosmic history. They rebelled. The Atrahasis epic, one of the most important documents from ancient Mesopotamia, records the Igigi rebellion in detail that suggests the Babylonian scribes who preserved it understood its significance. The lesser gods gathered together, their faces burning with anger, their tools cast aside, their labor abandoned. They marched on the temple of Enlil in the night, surrounding it with fire, demanding that the Lord of the Command hear their grievance. The load is too heavy, the work too hard. The text records them crying. Their muscles ached with the toil. Their God-given bodies had been pushed beyond endurance, and they would work no more. Consider what this means. The Anunnaki had established what they believed to be a perfect hierarchy, a cosmic order in which power flowed downward and labor flowed upward, in which the great gods commanded and the lesser gods obeyed. And it had failed. Not because of external threat or cosmic catastrophe, but because the beings at the bottom of the divine hierarchy had reached their limit and chosen defiance over continued suffering. The Anunnaki were not omnipotent. They could not simply will the canals to dig themselves or the mines to yield their treasures without effort. They needed workers, and their workers had quit. Enlil awoke to the sound of the mob outside his temple, and his response, according to the tablets, was fury. He demanded to know who had organized this uprising, who had dared to disrupt the divine order, who should be executed as an example to the others. But his counselor Nusku, sent to investigate, returned with an answer that offered no easy solution. The rebellion was unanimous. Every single Igigi had joined. There was no ringleader to punish because the grievance was universal. The divine labor force had collectively decided that they would rather face the wrath of the great gods than continue their endless toil. This was the crisis that would lead to the creation of humanity. The Divine Council convened to address the problem, and the tablets preserve what seems to be a genuine debate about how to proceed. Enlil favored violent suppression, the reassertion of hierarchy through force, the reminder that the great gods were great precisely because they could destroy those who defied them. But Enki, ever the pragmatist, ever the problem solver, saw an opportunity in the crisis. The Igigi would not return to their labor willingly. Forced labor would require constant enforcement, which would itself become a burden. The system, as designed, was fundamentally flawed because it concentrated all productive work in a population that had proven itself capable of resistance. What was needed was not a repaired hierarchy, but a new solution entirely. What was needed was a new kind of worker, one that would be grateful for existence itself, one that would labor willingly because labor was its purpose, one that could be created rather than coerced. What was needed was something made from earthly material, infused with just enough divine essence to be useful, but not enough to be threatening. Enki proposed the creation of humanity. The creation itself is described in multiple texts with varying details, but the core elements remain consistent across different versions and different eras of Mesopotamian civilization. The raw material would be clay, the humble substance of the riverbank, the same material from which bricks were made and on which records were inscribed. But clay alone would be insufficient. The new beings needed something to animate them, something to give them purpose and direction, and just enough consciousness to follow commands. They needed a divine component, and so a god was slain. The tablets name him variously, sometimes calling him Geshtu-E, the god of intelligence, sometimes identifying him only as a god who had intelligence. His blood was mixed with the clay. His flesh was incorporated into the new beings. His spirit, that divine essence that distinguished gods from dirt, was distributed among the first humans like an inheritance divided among many heirs. Enough for each to receive a portion, but not enough for any to rival the whole. The goddess Ninmah, also called Ninhursag, and known as the Mother of the Gods, performed the actual work of creation. She took the clay mixed with divine blood. She shaped it. She spoke the words of power that would animate the new beings. And from her hands emerged the first humans, 14 of them according to some accounts, 7 male and 7 female, placed in the world to fulfill the purpose for which they had been designed. That purpose was labor. The texts are explicit about this in a way that modern readers sometimes find uncomfortable. The Sumerian word Lulu, one of the earliest terms for humanity, now means primitive worker. It does not suggest partnership or offspring or children of the gods. It suggests a tool that can move and breathe and follow instructions. The new beings were created to bear the yoke of the gods, to pick up the tools that the Igigi had thrown down, to dig the canals and work the mines, and perform the endless maintenance that civilization required. They were biological technology. They were a solution to a labor problem. They were us. The transfer of divine knowledge to these new workers was carefully calibrated to ensure their usefulness without enabling their independence. They needed to know how to farm, so they were taught the basics of agriculture, how to plant and harvest and store grain. They needed to know how to tend animals, so they were given the rudiments of animal husbandry. They needed to know how to build, so they received instruction in basic construction, enough to maintain the temples and dig the channels, but not enough to create wonders of their own. The me that governed these crafts was shared in limited form, just enough function and no more, like giving a servant the key to the pantry but not to the treasury. The great technologies, the advanced knowledge, the sources of true power remained firmly in divine hands. This was the arrangement, and it was intended to last forever. The cities of the gods became cities with human populations, mortal servants living in the shadows of ziggurats that rose like artificial mountains from the flat Mesopotamian plain. Eridu and Nippur and Uruk and Ur, filled with people whose lives were organized around service to divine masters. Each day began with offerings, on food and drink set before the statues that represented the divine presence, the aroma rising to please gods who had physical needs, even as they possessed supernatural powers. Each day continued with labor, the endless tasks that kept the waters flowing, and the fields producing, and the temples in good repair. Each day ended with prayers, the hope that the gods would continue to look favorably on their servants and not withdraw the blessings that made survival possible. The psychological landscape of early humanity, if the tablets accurately reflect it, was one of complete cosmic certainty. Everyone knew their place. The gods were above, immortal and powerful beyond comprehension. Humanity was below, mortal and limited, but protected by their usefulness. The arrangement benefited both parties, or so it seemed. Though the gods received the service they required, humans received existence and the divine guidance that made civilization possible. There was no reason for this to ever change, except that creation, once initiated, does not remain static. The new workers proved remarkably effective at their assigned tasks. They multiplied as biological beings do, filling the cities and spreading across the land. What had begun as 14 individuals became thousands, then tens of thousands, then populations that exceeded anything the divine planners had anticipated. The earth, which had been quiet before the creation of humanity, began to fill with the sounds of human activity, the noise of a species that had been designed for labor, but was beginning to develop in ways that exceeded its original parameters. The texts tell us that this noise disturbed Enlil. The great god found himself unable to sleep, troubled by the clamor of the human populations that now covered the earth. The standard interpretation of this passage treats it as a complaint about literal noise, too many people making too much sound, keeping a cranky deity awake. But the Akkadian word used, rigmu, carries connotations beyond mere volume. It suggests uproar, tumult, the sound of something rising. And Enlil's response to this noise was not to ask for quiet or to relocate to somewhere more peaceful. His response was to begin planning the reduction or elimination of the very beings his civilization had created. Why would a god who had accepted the creation of humanity as a solution to the labor crisis now seek to destroy that solution? Why would useful tools suddenly become intolerable? Now, the tablets do not answer this question directly, but they provide hints that suggest an answer more unsettling than simple divine irritability. Humans were not remaining within their design parameters. They were growing in ways that exceeded expectation. They were becoming more. The blood of the slain god that had been mixed into their creation was not a passive ingredient. Divine essence, even diluted, even distributed among millions of descendants, carried properties that the creators had not fully anticipated. Each generation that passed, each birth that added to the human population, each life that accumulated experience and passed wisdom to the next, was adding to something. A momentum was building, a trajectory was establishing itself. And somewhere in the collective unconscious of humanity, now or perhaps in specific individuals whose stories we have lost, the divine inheritance was beginning to wake. The gods had created workers. But blood is a strange inheritance, and clay mixed with divine essence does not remain merely clay. The arrangement might have continued forever, gods above and humans below, each knowing their role in the cosmic order. But when you create life from materials that include your own essence, you cannot fully control what will grow. You have planted a seed with your own DNA, metaphorically speaking, and seeds do not always grow into what the planter intended. Sometimes they grow into something that rivals the garden itself. And in the generations that followed creation, in the accumulating centuries of human existence, something began to grow that would eventually force the gods to make a choice they had never anticipated having to make. Something began to grow indeed. There exists a text that mainstream scholarship rarely discusses in full. A text that was excluded from the biblical canon, yet preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition and rediscovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this text is known as the Book of Enoch, or more precisely, First Enoch. And within its pages, we find a narrative that parallels and expands upon one of the most mysterious passages in all of Genesis. A narrative about beings called the Watchers. In the Aramaic tongue, they were called the Irin, meaning those who are awake or those who watch. And according to the Enochian account, there were 200 of them. 200 divine beings who made a decision that would alter the trajectory of everything that followed. They descended, not to Eridu or Nippur or any of the sacred cities of Sumer, but to a mountain called Hermon, a name that some scholars connect to the Hebrew word Sherem, meaning devoted to destruction or set apart for a sacred and terrible purpose. And there on that mountain, these 200 made a pact with one another, a binding oath that would tie their fates together in what they themselves knew to be transgression. The leader among them was Semjaza, sometimes written Samyaza, or Shemihaza, depending on the manuscript tradition. And he was afraid to act alone, afraid that he would bear the full weight of divine punishment while the others escaped. And so, before the descent was complete, they swore together, the all 200 of them, that they would share equally in whatever consequences followed. This detail matters. This was not an accident or a moment of weakness, but a coordinated action undertaken with full knowledge that it violated cosmic law. And what was their transgression? The Enochian texts are explicit. They looked upon the daughters of men and found them beautiful, and they took wives for themselves from among human women, and from these unions children were born, children who were neither fully divine nor fully human, but something new, something that had never existed before in all the long ages of the world. Now, if this sounds familiar, it should, because in the 6th chapter of Genesis, we find a compressed version of the same account. A passage so strange and so disconnected from its surrounding narrative that scholars have puzzled over it for centuries. A passage that speaks of the sons of God seeing the daughters of men and taking wives from among them, and of the Nephilim being on the earth in those days and also afterward, and of heroes of old and men of renown. The canonical text gives us only 4 verses. The Enochian tradition gives us chapters upon chapters of detail. But here is what becomes truly interesting when we place these accounts alongside the Sumerian material we have already explored. In the cuneiform tablets, there is a class of divine beings called the Igigi, lesser gods who serve the greater Anunnaki, who maintained the workings of heaven and earth, who grew tired of their labor and whose rebellion precipitated the creation of humanity as a replacement workforce. The Igigi are sometimes described as the gods of heaven, in contrast to the Anunnaki who came to earth. But the boundaries between these categories were never absolute, and there are texts that suggest some of the Igigi did descend, did interact directly with the human population, did cross boundaries that were meant to remain fixed. The pattern begins to emerge. Across multiple ancient traditions, Sumerian and Hebrew and Aramaic, we find accounts of a secondary tier of divine beings who did not maintain proper distance from humanity, who transgressed the established order, who mingled their essence with mortal flesh. The taking of human wives raises questions that the ancient texts do not fully answer. Was this union voluntary on the part of the women? Were they willing participants drawn by the beauty and power of divine beings, or were they taken by force, victims of celestial desire that recognized no human right of refusal? The Book of Enoch uses language that could support either reading, and perhaps the ambiguity is itself significant. Perhaps the ancient authors recognized that power imbalances of such magnitude make the concept of consent nearly meaningless. Perhaps it does not matter whether the daughters of men chose or were chosen, because the outcome was the same either way. Hybridization began. Divine blood entered human bloodlines. The genetic boundary between creator and creation was breached, and from this breach emerged beings that would reshape the world. But the physical union was only part of what transpired on Mount Hermon. The oath that bound the Watchers together included another element, another transgression that in some ways exceeded even the taking of wives. And this was the systematic transfer of forbidden knowledge to human minds. Each of the Watchers, according to the Enochian account, taught specific arts and sciences that had previously been reserved for divine beings alone. Azazel taught humanity how to forge weapons and armor, how to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, the entire technology of organized warfare that transforms scattered violence into military power. He also taught the making of jewelry and cosmetics, the use of antimony for darkening eyes and precious stones for adornment. And while these might seem frivolous compared to weapons of war, they represent something profound. The technology of beauty, the ability to enhance and transform the human form, to project status and attract desire, to manipulate perception itself. Semjaza taught enchantments and the cutting of roots, which is to say, herbal medicine and its shadow twin magic, the knowledge of which plants heal and which plants harm, and which plants alter consciousness. The entire pharmacopoeia that gives humans power over their own bodies and the bodies of others. Amarhos taught the resolving of enchantments, which is counter-magic, the ability to break spells and undo curses, defensive knowledge that presupposes offensive capability on the other side. Barakijal taught astrology, the reading of stars for meaning and prophecy, thus the conviction that celestial movements reflect and perhaps determine terrestrial events. Kokabel taught the constellations themselves, the mapping of the heavens, the navigation system that allows humans to orient themselves in space and time without divine guidance. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of clouds, which is meteorology, the ability to read and perhaps influence weather patterns. Arakiel taught the signs of the earth, geology and perhaps agriculture, the reading of soil and stone and season. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun, the solar calendar that structures planting and harvest and festival and the long rhythms of the year. Sariel taught the course of the moon, the lunar calendar that governs tides and cycles and older rhythms still. Consider what this catalogue represents when taken as a whole. Military technology, medical knowledge, astronomical prediction, weather reading, agricultural timing, calendar systems, the ability to read the earth and sky and plan accordingly. This is not a random collection of skills, but the complete toolkit for independent civilization, the entire suite of capabilities that allows a people to organize themselves, feed themselves, defend themselves, heal themselves, and predict the movements of heavens and seasons without recourse to divine instruction. Before these teachings, humans knew only what the gods chose to reveal through temple priests and divine intermediaries. After these teachings, humans could learn for themselves, could pass knowledge to their children, could build upon foundations without waiting for heavenly permission. The Watchers did not merely break a sexual taboo, they broke a monopoly, and they shattered the information asymmetry that had kept humanity dependent and manageable. They made us dangerous. And now we must speak of the children, the offspring of these forbidden unions, the beings that the Hebrew tradition calls the Nephilim. The word itself is debated. Some scholars connect it to the root nephal, meaning to fall, which would make them the fallen ones, either those who fell from heaven or those who cause others to fall, the bringers of downfall. Others connect it to different roots, suggesting giants or mighty ones, or those of great renown. What is not debated is that the ancient texts describe them as beings of extraordinary stature and capability, beings who exceeded normal human parameters in ways that frightened and awed those who encountered them. The Book of Enoch describes them as giants who consumed the produce of humanity until humans could no longer sustain them, whereupon they turned to consuming humans themselves, and then animals, and then drinking blood and committing every manner of sin, a picture of appetite without limit, of power without restraint. The giants in numbers who made the Israelite scouts feel like grasshoppers. The sons of Anak, the Rephaim, Goliath of Gath and his brothers, Og of Bashan, who slept in an iron bed 9 cubits long. Across the biblical text, we find traces of these beings, echoes of a population that persisted long after it should have been destroyed, beings that retained something of divine potency in their blood and bone, but But the canonical scriptures give us only fragments. The Enochian tradition gives us names. Semjaza's offspring, Azazel's children. The giants born of the 200, each inheriting something of their father's particular knowledge, each carrying divine genes in human frames. The Sumerian tradition offers its own parallel in the figures of the Apkallu, the sages who brought civilization to humanity, beings depicted in art as part human and part something else, fish-cloaked or bird-winged, intermediaries between the divine and mortal realms. Before the flood, the Apkallu were purely divine or purely monstrous. After the flood, we begin to see human Apkallu, mortal sages who somehow carried the knowledge and perhaps the bloodline of earlier times. The Umanu, the master craftsmen and scholars of later periods, claimed descent from these figures, claimed a lineage that connected them to something older and greater than ordinary humanity. The hero traditions of the ancient world begin to make a different kind of sense when viewed through this lens. Gilgamesh, 2/3 divine and 1/3 human according to the texts, whose strength exceeded all other men, who sought immortality because he could remember what he had lost, who walked between worlds in ways that ordinary humans could not. The heroes of Greek myth, fathered by gods on mortal women, carrying divine blood that manifested as superhuman capability. Heracles and Perseus and Achilles and all the rest, each a hybrid, each exceeding the normal limits of the human frame. These stories may preserve a memory of something that actually occurred, not as mythology, but as biology, not as symbol, but as genetics. The Nephilim were not merely large humans or imaginative exaggerations of tribal warriors. They were a new category of being, carrying divine knowledge in their minds and divine blood in their veins, mortal enough to live on earth, yet powerful enough to challenge the authority that had created them. And this is the crucial point that the ancient texts dance around without ever quite stating directly. The children exceeded their parents. The hybrids surpassed both the humans who bore them and, perhaps, the divine beings who sired them. When you combine divine essence with human adaptability, when you fuse celestial knowledge with mortal ambition, when you create beings who have access to forbidden technologies, yet also possess the hunger and drive that the gods themselves seem to lack, you create something unpredictable. You create something that can grow. You create something that can threaten. The Nephilim did not simply exist. They built, they conquered, they expanded. They gathered followers and established kingdoms and accumulated power in ways that pure humans never had. The book of Genesis calls them heroes of old and men of renown, and that phrase is usually read as praise, as nostalgia for a golden age of mighty warriors. But consider another reading. Renown for what? Heroes of what kind? The Greek heroes were celebrated for killing monsters and defying gods. The Nephilim were not celebrated in the traditions that survived. They were remembered with fear as devourers and tyrants, as beings whose appetites could not be satisfied and whose power could not be checked. They were men of renown in the same sense that a conqueror is renowned, in the same sense that a disaster is remembered, not beloved but unforgettable, are not honored but feared. And here is what the texts suggest, but rarely state explicitly. The Nephilim knew things, not just the skills their fathers had taught to humanity at large, but deeper knowledge, personal knowledge, the kind of understanding that comes from growing up in a household where divine secrets are daily conversation. They knew how the gods maintained power. They knew the weaknesses of heaven. They knew, perhaps, how to build things that the Anunnaki would recognize as threats, how to organize forces that could challenge divine authority, how to tap into powers that were supposed to remain forever beyond human reach. The 70 generations that the Book of Enoch mentions as the period of the Watcher's imprisonment represents, if we calculate it out, roughly 1700 years. Long enough for this knowledge to spread through populations, to be refined and expanded, to compound generation after generation. The children taught their children who taught their children, and each generation added to the inheritance, building on what came before, developing capabilities that the original Watchers might not have imagined possible. This is how knowledge works. This is how power accumulates. This is how a species that was created to dig canals and offer sacrifices transforms into something else entirely. By the time the divine councils turned their attention fully to the situation on Earth, by the time Enlil and his allies began to consider what must be done about the noise and the turbulence and the rising power below, it may already have been too late. The Nephilim were not a problem that could be solved by sending a plague or withholding rain. They were a population, dispersed and multiplying, carrying divine blood and forbidden knowledge, building civilizations and gathering strength. Some of them, the texts suggest, had become powerful enough to be called gods themselves by the humans who served them. The line between creator and created was blurring beyond recognition. The experiment had exceeded its parameters. The servants had become rivals. And somewhere in the courts of heaven, in the council chambers where the Anunnaki had once deliberated with perfect confidence in their own supremacy, there must have come a moment of terrible recognition. The servants they had made from clay and blood were no longer merely servants, and the children born of forbidden unions were no longer merely children. Something new walked the earth, something that remembered divine secrets and possessed human ambition, something that could learn and grow and build and fight in ways that pure humans never could, and that the gods themselves had never anticipated. For the first time in the long history of the Anunnaki, for the first time since they descended from heaven and established their cities and set themselves up as masters of all they surveyed, the gods began to feel something unfamiliar stirring in their immortal hearts. They began to feel afraid. In the clay tablets that scholars call the Atrahasis, preserved across 3 distinct copies spanning centuries of Mesopotamian history, there exists a passage that has long troubled careful readers. The god Enlil, lord of the command and master of the earthly realm, brings a complaint before the divine assembly. The noise of humanity, he declares, has become too intense. He cannot sleep. He cannot rest. The clamor rising from the cities below has grown unbearable, and something must be done. For generations, translators have rendered the Akkadian word rigmu simply as noise, and scholars have interpreted this complaint literally. Humanity had multiplied. Cities had grown crowded. The sounds of human activity, of industry and commerce and daily life had become an annoyance to divine ears. This reading fits comfortably within our assumptions about distant, easily irritated gods. But the Akkadian language is layered with meaning, and Rigmu carries shadows that the simple word noise does not capture. Rigmu can mean uproar. It can mean tumult. It can mean the roar of something rising, the sound of a force gathering strength. When we read Enlil's complaint with this fuller understanding, When we hear not merely noise but the rumble of ascent, the tone of the passage shifts dramatically. This is not a God annoyed by barking dogs or crying children. This is a God who hears something in the distance that makes him uneasy. This is a God registering a threat. The divine council that convenes in response to Enlil's complaint is documented across multiple textual traditions, and the debate that unfolds reveals a pantheon divided. Enlil's position is unambiguous. Humanity must be reduced. The creatures they created for labor have become something else, something problematic, and corrective action is required. But Enki, the god of wisdom and deep waters, takes a different stance. He argues for preservation, for measured response, for allowing humanity to continue. The conventional interpretation frames this as divine compassion, as Enki's fondness for his creations overriding the harsher judgment of his brother god. But there is another way to read Enki's position. Perhaps the god of wisdom was wise enough to recognize what Enlil refused to see. Perhaps Enki understood that destruction might not work. Perhaps he looked at what humanity had become in the generations since creation, at the knowledge they had accumulated and the capabilities they had developed, and calculated that annihilation was no longer a certain outcome. If this reading seems too bold, consider what happens next. The Council authorizes a series of divine weapons against humanity, and each one fails. First comes plague. The texts describe a pestilence released upon the human population, a sickness designed to thin the herds and remind the creatures of their fragility. Humanity should have crumbled. They had no medicine as the gods understood it, no divine protection, no resources to combat biological warfare waged by their creators. And yet the tablets record that humanity survived. They diminished, but did not disappear. They suffered, but endured. The plague passed, and they remained. Then comes drought. The gods withhold the rains, seal the aquifers, turn the fertile crescent into dust. Agriculture should have collapsed. Famine should have followed. The population should have crashed to manageable levels. But again, the texts record survival. Humanity adapted. They found water where water should not have been. And they stretched their resources in ways that the divine observers had not anticipated. The drought passed, and they remained. Then comes famine proper. Not merely the absence of rain, but the active failure of crops, the withering of livestock, the systematic removal of sustenance. This should have been the end. Creatures made from clay to serve as agricultural labor should not have been able to survive the withdrawal of agriculture itself. And yet, once more, the tablets record survival. Humanity endured. They found ways. They persisted. Each divine weapon met with human resilience, and with each failure, the Council's options narrowed. We must pause here to consider what these failures imply. If humanity had been merely the primitive workers they were created to be, the Lulu fashioned from clay and divine blood, these measures should have succeeded easily. Plague should have swept through populations without resistance. Drought should have broken their water supplies. Famine should have starved them into submission or extinction. The gods had created humanity. They knew exactly what they were dealing with, or so they thought. The fact that each measure failed suggests that humanity had become something other than what was created. Something had changed in the generations between creation and complaint. The divine blood in human veins had awakened. The forbidden knowledge transferred by the Watchers had taken root and flourished. the Nephilim bloodlines had spread and strengthened. By the time Enlil registered the noise, the rumble, the rising threat, humanity was no longer the fragile servant species that had been fashioned in the beginning. They had become harder to kill than they should have been. The Divine Council, facing this evidence of unexpected resilience, arrived at a terrible decision. No more measured responses, no more targeted plagues or regional droughts. Total annihilation, the flood. The texts describe an oath taken by all the Anunnaki, a binding commitment to destroy humanity completely. Every god swore, every divine being agreed. This would not be correction or management. This would be extinction, the complete erasure of the human experiment from the face of the earth. The waters would rise, the cities would drown, the noise would finally cease. Enki, bound by the oath, found a way around it. He did not speak directly to his servant Utnapishtim, the one the Hebrews would call Noah, and other traditions would name by other names. Instead, he spoke to a wall, while knowing that Utnapishtim stood behind it. Build a boat, the god of wisdom advised the reeds and the bricks. Fill it with the seed of all living things. The flood is coming. This circumvention has been read as divine mercy, as Enki's compassion overreading his obligation. But consider another reading. Enki was the god of wisdom, the cleverest of the Anunnaki, the one who understood patterns and possibilities. If he truly believed that the flood would succeed in its purpose, if he believed that total destruction was achievable, why would he risk the wrath of the entire pantheon to save one family? Perhaps Enki acted not out of sentiment, but out of strategy. Perhaps he calculated that total destruction was impossible, that some humans would survive regardless, that the flood would fail just as the plague and drought and famine had failed. Perhaps he chose to ensure that the survivors included those loyal to him, those who would remember his warning, those who would emerge into the post-flood world with a debt to Enki rather than to Enlil. Strategic preservation rather than foolish mercy. The flood came, and the texts describe it in vivid detail. The waters rose from below and fell from above. The boundaries between the firmaments dissolved. Cities vanished, populations drowned. The great cleansing that the Divine Council had demanded seemed to be proceeding according to plan. But then the tablets record something strange. They record the fear of the gods themselves. The Anunnaki, we are told, cowered like dogs. They crouched against their outer wall of heaven. They wept. Inanna cried out like a woman in travail. The gods who had sent the flood were themselves terrified by what they had unleashed. This detail has puzzled scholars for generations. If the gods controlled the flood, if they had designed and deployed it according to their will, why would they fear it? You do not cower from a weapon you yourself are wielding. You do not weep at destruction you have carefully planned, unless the flood was not entirely under divine control, unless in attempting to destroy humanity, the gods had unleashed forces they could not fully master. Unless the accumulated power of the Nephilim, the forbidden knowledge, the awakened divine blood in human veins had created conditions that even cosmic weapons could not cleanly resolve. The flood came. The gods cowered. And when the waters receded, when the boat came to rest on the mountain, when Utnapishtim emerged to offer sacrifice, humanity still existed, not just one family. The geographic spread of flood narratives across every culture on Earth suggests that survival was widespread. The Sumerian Ziusudra, the Akkadian Utnapishtim, The Hebrew Noah, the Greek Deucalion, the Indian Manu, the Chinese Gunyu, the Mesoamerican accounts, the flood stories of indigenous peoples on every continent. If only one family had survived, these stories would not exist in such diversity. The flood was meant to be total. It was not. Humanity, dispersed and resilient and carrying knowledge the gods had never intended them to possess, survived in multiple locations. The genocide failed. When Enlil discovered that survivors existed, his rage was immense. The texts describe his fury at learning that his brother had circumvented the oath, that the eradication he had demanded had been undermined. But observe what happens next. There is no second flood. There is no renewed attempt at annihilation. Instead, there is a covenant. The divine assembly agrees that such destruction will never again be attempted. This is typically read as divine mercy, as the gods relenting and promising never again to harm humanity so severely. But covenants are agreements between parties with power. You do not make covenants with creatures you can destroy at will. You make covenants when destruction has been tried and has failed, when you have learned the limits of your own capability, when you must accept that the other party can no longer be eliminated and must instead be negotiated with. The post-flood covenant was not mercy, it was recognition. A recognition that humanity had become something the gods could not destroy. Recognition that the created had exceeded the creator. Recognition that the power balance had fundamentally shifted. The post-flood world looked very different from what came before, and the changes that emerge in the textual record tell a story of divine retreat. Consider the incident at Babel, recorded in the Hebrew texts but echoing themes present in Sumerian material. Humanity, unified in language and purpose, begins to build a tower. The structure rises toward the heavens, a physical manifestation of human ambition and capability. And the divine response is telling. The gods look down and see the tower rising. They observe humanity working in concert, speaking a single language, pursuing a shared goal. And they say among themselves that now nothing humanity plans to do will be impossible for them. Nothing impossible. This is not the language of annoyed supervisors watching workers build an unauthorized structure. This is the language of fear. The gods saw unified humanity accomplishing something that should not have been possible, and they recognized that if this continued, no barrier would hold. The divine response was not destruction. They had tried destruction. It had failed. Instead, the response was disruption. Confuse their language, scatter them across the earth, break their unity, make it harder for them to cooperate. These are not the actions of supreme beings confident in their power. These are the tactics of a force that fears it cannot win a direct confrontation. It is a force that must resort to division and confusion because domination is no longer possible. The Sumerian king list records another crucial transition. After the flood had swept over, the list declares, "Kingship descended from heaven." This phrase is often read as divine gift, as the gods graciously granting political authority to human beings. But observe who receives this kingship. Not the gods themselves, not divine rulers walking among humanity, human kings, mortal sovereigns ruling over mortal populations. Before the flood, the gods had ruled directly. Enlil commanded from Nippur. Enki presided from Eridu. Divine beings walked among their human servants and governed every aspect of existence. After the flood, this direct governance ends. Kingship descends to human hands, and with each generation, The distance between divine and human authority grows. The gods do not disappear immediately. They maintain temples, they receive offerings, they communicate through priests and oracles and dreams, but they no longer walk among humanity as they once did. They no longer sit in judgment over daily affairs. They retreat to specific locations, to mountain tops and remote temples, to places where human access is limited and controlled. The Apkallu tradition reflects this transition with particular clarity. Before the flood, the Apkallu were divine beings, sages sent by the gods to teach humanity the arts of civilization. They served as direct intermediaries between the divine realm and the human world. After the flood, the Apkallu tradition continues, but now the sages are human. Mortal men and women carry the knowledge that once resided only with divine teachers. The wisdom of the gods has passed into human custody. This transition is typically framed as divine gift, as the gods generously educating their human servants. But gifts are offered freely. What if this knowledge was not offered but taken? What if the accumulated transfers through the Watchers, through the Nephilim, through generations of boundary violations, had reached a point where humans possessed divine knowledge, regardless of divine intention? What if the Apkallu transition represents not generosity, but acknowledgement that humans had already assumed roles the gods could no longer exclusively hold? The Nephilim themselves present the strongest evidence for this reading. The Book of Numbers records that when the Israelites sent scouts into Canaan, they returned with a terrifying report. Giants lived in that land, they declared, descendants of the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. But wait. The flood was sent specifically to destroy the Nephilim bloodlines, to eliminate the hybrid offspring of divine and human union, to cleanse the earth of beings that had exceeded their intended boundaries. If the flood had succeeded in its purpose, how did Nephilim descendants survive to populate Canaan? How did giants walk the earth in the centuries after the Great Destruction? The survival of Nephilim bloodlines after a flood designed to eliminate them is perhaps the clearest evidence that the divine plan failed. These were not merely tall humans. These were beings carrying divine essence in concentrated form. Beings who had inherited the power and knowledge and capability of their Watcher fathers. If ordinary humans could survive the flood through resilience and dispersal, how much more could beings with divine blood in their veins? The Nephilim could not be destroyed because they had become too powerful to destroy. The divine weapons that should have erased them bounced off like water off stone. They emerged from the flood era, diminished perhaps in number, but intact in bloodline, carrying forward the very power the gods had sought to eliminate. As the generations passed, the pattern of divine withdrawal accelerated. Temples that once saw daily divine visitation became places where priests spoke on behalf of absent gods. Oracles that once channeled direct divine voice became institutions of interpretation and ambiguity. The gods retreated to ever more remote locations, appearing less frequently, speaking less directly, involving themselves less completely in human affairs. The textual record tracks this withdrawal across centuries. Early Sumerian texts describe gods who are present and active, who walk among their people and make direct decisions. Later, Akkadian and Babylonian texts describe gods who are more distant, who must be appeased and petitioned, who work through intermediaries and signs. By the time we reach the late Babylonian period, the gods have become almost entirely abstract, forces to be placated rather than persons to be encountered. Some scholars attribute this shift to religious evolution, to humanity developing more sophisticated theological concepts. But there is another explanation. The gods withdrew because they had no choice. Humanity had become something that divine authority could not contain. The created had risen against the creator and had not been defeated. The noise that Enlil heard was not the sound of annoying servants, but the rumble of ascending power, and that power had proven resilient beyond divine calculation. Plague failed, drought failed, famine failed, the flood failed. The scattering at Babel slowed, but did not stop human advancement. With each passing generation, the gap between divine capability and human potential narrowed. The gods were not abandoning humanity out of disinterest or completion. They were retreating because they could no longer hold their ground. And then, at some point that the textual record does not precisely mark, they were gone. The temples still stood. The offerings still burned. The prayers still rose toward heaven as they had for millennia. But no one answered. The great silence descended, and humanity was left alone with the ruins of divine civilization and the echoes of departed gods. For 5,000 years, we have asked why they left us. We have constructed elaborate theologies around divine mystery, around tests and trials, and inscrutable purposes. We have assumed that we were abandoned, that we were found wanting, that the gods grew tired of their troublesome creation and moved on to other interests. But perhaps we have been asking the wrong question. Perhaps the question is not why they left us, but what we became that made them leave. What if the departure was not abandonment but retreat? What if the silence was not rejection but defeat? What if the created had risen against the creator, and the creator had discovered, too late, that the creation had become something that could no longer be controlled? The last temple hymns of Sumer carry a tone that scholars have struggled to name for over a century, a quality that sits somewhere between grief and something else, something harder to place. And when you read these late compositions from the dying days of the third dynasty of Ur, you notice that the language has changed. That where earlier texts spoke of gods who walked among the ziggurats and accepted offerings from human hands, these later texts speak of absence, of silence, of divine figures who no longer answer when called. And the priesthoods of that era developed elaborate rituals of lamentation, songs sung to empty thrones, prayers offered to statues that had once been vessels for living presence, but now stood hollow in their shrines. And the question that echoes through these final records is not whether the gods departed, but how completely they vanished, how suddenly the temples that had hummed with divine activity for millennia fell quiet. And we have been taught to read this silence as abandonment, as the natural fading of mythological belief, as humanity outgrowing its need for invisible parents. But there is another way to read these texts, another interpretation that fits the evidence perhaps more closely than the story we have told ourselves. Because when you examine what was left behind, when you catalogue the knowledge that appears in Sumerian civilization at its height, and then trace what happened to that knowledge after the silence began, you find patterns that suggest not an orderly withdrawal, but something closer to retreat, something closer to flight. Consider the technologies that flourished in ancient Mesopotamia and then vanished without clear successors. The advanced astronomical calculations that appear fully formed in the earliest readable tablets, as though dropped from somewhere else. The metallurgical techniques that produced alloys we struggle to replicate today. The agricultural systems and irrigation networks that transformed desert into garden with an efficiency that seems to exceed what trial and error alone could produce. These innovations did not develop gradually in the archaeological record. They appear, they function at remarkable levels, and then over the centuries following the divine silence, they degrade, they simplify, they are forgotten. And this pattern repeats across multiple domains of knowledge, as though someone had handed humanity a toolkit and then departed before we fully understood how to maintain it. And the question this raises is not the question we usually ask. The question is not why did they leave us? The question is what made them go? What rose on this earth that was powerful enough to drive out beings who had ruled unchallenged for millennia? And when you hold that question in your mind and return to the textual evidence we have examined, to the Nephilim who survived the flood, meant to destroy them, to the forbidden knowledge that had been spreading through human bloodlines for 70 generations, to the divine councils that convened in fear rather than confidence, to the attempted genocides that failed again and again, you begin to see the outline of an answer. You begin to understand that there may have been a confrontation at the end of the Age of Gods, a final reckoning between creators and creation, and that we have forgotten this confrontation, not because it was unimportant, but because it was the most important thing that ever happened to our species, a victory so complete that the victors themselves lost the memory of winning. In the centuries that followed the silence, knowledge did not simply disappear. It went underground. It was preserved in channels that have always been difficult to trace. Mystery schools that claimed descent from antediluvian teachers, priesthoods that guarded secrets passed down through carefully controlled lineages. And when scholars examine these traditions, they find a curious consistency. A set of core teachings that appear across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, mathematical relationships and astronomical observations and metaphysical principles that seem to derive from a common source far older than any civilization we have officially acknowledged. And the keepers of these traditions often claimed that their knowledge came from beings who had walked the earth before the flood, from teachers who were more than human, but had chosen to share what they knew with chosen students. And we can dismiss these claims as myth, as the universal human tendency to attribute sacred knowledge to divine origins. But we can also consider the possibility that they are remembering something real. That somewhere in the aftermath of the gods' departure, a group or groups of inheritors took responsibility for preserving what had been left behind, for organizing the fragments of divine technology and divine understanding into systems that could be transmitted across generations. And the existence of such inheritors would explain certain anomalies in the historical record, would explain how advanced knowledge appears in contexts where it should not exist, how civilizations seem to leap forward in capability without the expected developmental stages, how certain architectural and engineering achievements of the ancient world exceed what their supposed builders should have been able to accomplish, and threading through these anomalies is the suggestion of a successor civilization. A culture or network of cultures that rose in the vacuum left by the departing gods, that possessed capabilities we have only begun to suspect, and that eventually vanished itself, leaving behind only traces and fragments and the persistent human intuition that something is missing from our official history, that the timeline we have constructed for human development has gaps that no one has satisfactorily explained. The forgetting itself may not have been accidental when you consider how thoroughly the old knowledge was lost. You have to wonder whether the loss was merely the natural decay of time, or whether something more deliberate was involved. The cuneiform libraries that held hundreds of thousands of tablets were buried and abandoned. The oral traditions that had preserved stories for thousands of years were diluted generation by generation until only fragments remained. The languages themselves died and were not deciphered again until the 19th century. And all of this loss occurred in a pattern that is almost too complete, too thorough, as though someone or something wanted the old records to disappear, wanted the memory of what had actually happened to fade from human consciousness. And this raises another uncomfortable question. If we were the victors in whatever confrontation ended the Age of Gods, why did we forget our victory? Why did we not preserve the memory of our greatest achievement? And there are possible answers to this question. Perhaps the victory came at such cost that we chose to forget. Perhaps the knowledge required to win was so dangerous that the inheritors decided to bury it along with the memory of its use. Perhaps the forgetting was itself a condition of the victory, a price paid for the departure of beings who might otherwise have returned. Or perhaps the forgetting was imposed from within, by those among us who understood that humanity was not ready to carry the full weight of what we had become, who decided that a species capable of driving out its creators might be a species that needed to forget its own power until it had matured enough to use that power wisely. And so we arrive at the reversal that has been building throughout this long night of examination, the reversal that changes everything about how we understand ourselves and our place in the story of this world. Because if the evidence we have traced is read correctly, if the textual fragments and archaeological anomalies and persistent traditions are pointing where they seem to point, then we were never the abandoned children of indifferent gods. We were never the victims of divine caprice or neglect. We were the rising threat that the divine councils feared. We were the noise that disturbed their sleep. We were the inheritors of forbidden knowledge and forbidden blood who grew too powerful to be controlled and too numerous to be destroyed. And the gods did not lose interest in us. They lost to us. They retreated from an earth that was no longer theirs to rule. They fled from the children they had made, who had become something they never intended. And the silence that fell over the temples was not the silence of abandonment, but the silence of aftermath. The quiet that follows when a great conflict has ended and the victors stand alone among the ruins, trying to remember what they were fighting for. This is the weight of inheritance that we carry without knowing we carry it. The knowledge that somewhere in our blood and our bones and our forgotten past lies the memory of what we overcame, the capability that made gods afraid, the power that changed the order of the world. And perhaps this is why the inheritors chose to help us forget. Because a species that knows it once drove out its creators might be a species that never learns humility, might be a species that rushes toward its own power without developing the wisdom to wield it. And so we were given the gift of not remembering. The mercy of believing ourselves small and lost and searching for meaning in a cosmos that seemed indifferent to our existence. And perhaps this was the right choice. Perhaps we needed these millennia of not knowing in order to become ready for knowing. The tablet still sits in its drawer in Philadelphia, 3,000 miles and 5,000 years from the hands that shaped it. And it carries the same weight it has always carried, the same 73 lines of wedge-shaped script pressed into clay by someone who was trying to record what they understood about the world and the forces that moved within it. And this tablet is not unique. There are hundreds of thousands of similar tablets scattered across the museums and collections of the world. Fragments of a library that once held more knowledge than we have yet recovered. And these fragments are patient. They have waited 5,000 years for us to develop the tools and the languages and the courage to read them properly, to look past the assumptions we have inherited and see what the ancient scribes were actually trying to tell us. And perhaps they can wait a little longer. Perhaps in the growing quiet of a night like this one, as the modern world hums with its distractions and its certainties, someone will pick up one of these tablets and read it fresh, will notice something that generations of scholars have missed, will ask the question that changes everything, and perhaps somewhere in that moment of recognition, we will begin to remember not just the words on the clay, but what the words point toward, the truth that has been hiding in plain sight for 5 millennia. The truth that the gods did not leave because we were unworthy of their attention, or because their mission was complete, or because they grew bored with the experiment they had started. They left because we became their equals. And equals are dangerous things to be, dangerous to those who once held power over you, dangerous to the order that once kept you in your place, and perhaps most of all, dangerous to yourself. Because once you know what you are capable of, once you remember the power that runs through your inheritance, you can never go back to believing you are small. You can never again accept the story that you were made merely to serve. And this is the invitation that waits in the silence after the gods. The invitation to remember who we are, to reclaim what we forgot, and to step into the inheritance that has been waiting for us all along.